Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
Hello, I am Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist, and this is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, and relationships. I am super happy to have Dr. Kimberly Applewhite with me today. She is a colleague of mine and here in Salt Lake City, and I'm excited for her to introduce herself here in a minute, but we're here to talk about relationships and connection and how important they are to all of our lives. I think most of us know that by now. I don't think I'm sharing any huge news. At the same time, with something so basic, it's still kind of baffling how complex relationships are and how common it is for all of us to struggle pretty profoundly in a lot of different ways. So we're kind of here to talk about that and maybe give you some ideas, some strategies, some tips, some ways that you can feel maybe a little less overwhelmed or normalize, some of the issues, especially around this holiday time, which tends to bring up some of these feels a little bit more intensely than other times. So we're currently doing this podcast on December 19th. So the week right before Christmas 2022. Some of you may hear this podcast after that time frame, but hopefully you'll take some of these ideas regardless of what time of the year you're listening. But regardless, is it okay if I call you Kimberly throughout the podcast, or would you prefer Dr. Applewhite? Because
Kim.
That sounds really fun too.
Kimberly is fine. Thank you so much for having me.
Sometimes when we earn those things, I'm like, just call me the doctor.
It's true. I like it displayed. It's something on the shelf, the mantle, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Kim, spend a few minutes telling us about you and kind of a little bit about your background. And I mean, I've listed your biography, but tell us a little bit about where you come from and what makes you tick.
Awesome. So, what makes me tick? That's an interesting tagline. I grew up on the East Coast, went to school in New York City. I have a doctorate in psychology. Initially was trained to work with kids, and my real love was going to be adolescence, especially that rough age 13 to 15 where people don't they're getting close to giving up on them. Oftentimes I'm like, throw them in the trash. But anyway, that's the age I love, just for the drama factor of it. And I've always had a passion for working with marginalized communities, people with intersectional identities, people who are at risk, who don't often seek mental health services as often as might be warranted. So then I did postdoc up in Massachusetts, and then I've been here in Utah for 6 years. Primarily the work I do is with dialectical behavior therapy, which is the gold standard treatment for borderline personality disorder, but also is meant for everyone, anyone who might need help regulating emotions in the context of invalidating environments, which many of us, through nature of our relationships, have been a part of. And so I just really love helping people work through the challenges of interpersonal connection, especially because when I was growing up, I felt like this big feeling girl that would often be like, I did this, or you did this, and I feel this, and you did this, and I feel this, and not really be able to use emotions for problem solving, to be able to value my own emotional experiences and use that to get the things that I want out of life. And so that is what I am motivated by in my work. And so that's taken me all kinds of places, working with all kinds of people. And so, I
love it. How did you end up out here in the Rocky Mountain West?
That's a good question. The sort of
New York. And my dad's from New York originally. So right. Kind of like White Plains area.
Oh yeah. I did my internship there in White Plains.
Okay. Yeah.
Westchester County. But we my husband went to school out here, undergrad. And so when he finished graduate school the second time, got recruited to work a job in education consulting. And so we moved out here in 2016. And then
Okay.
we have just stayed. Like, Utah has a way of sucking you in. I've been telling people lately, like, I went to the eye doctor a couple years after being here, and the guy was like, "Oh yeah, Utah just has a way of sucking you in. I never thought I would be here for a long time. Now I've been here for 7 years." And I was like, I will never be here for 7 years, but this is year 7 that we're on. And so I think that it's been nice for me to realize that just the unique cultural challenges of this area, and to know that everybody needs help. I definitely prefer racial diversity to this, where, we're at. It's been hard for me as a Black woman to, I guess, out east, I didn't have to be as intentional about seeking out community as I have had to be here. And so sometimes when I'm thinking about how to be effective in interpersonal relationships and think about what I want, I have to keep in account like how much energy I'm spending to like create my community, and balance that by saying, maybe I don't have time for other things, but I do like being here. There's so many pros to an intentionally cultivated community that I've just come to appreciate about being here. And so I'll miss it when I'm gone, and I have no plans to leave anytime soon.
Yeah. No, that is really interesting. We are definitely a very, I think, white state, very, LDS, Latter-day Saint state. So we do definitely have some cultural norms, right? In this, as most geographical spaces do,
Yeah.
It is interesting when either you're part of the in-group or not part of the in-group, which is some of what we'll talk about today as well. So depending on where you find yourself and what identifying markers, you feel like you have, in your own identity. So that's really interesting. Well, as I was thinking about our conversation today, I think about so many of the people I talk with in our offices, and there's a lot of shame around relationships. Like, people are like, do I have enough of them? Do I have too many of them? Am I not spending enough time on my relationships? Am I spending too much time? Why do the ones I have annoy me so much? Am I too needy? Am I codependent? Am I not dependent enough? Do I have like attachment issues? Am I a people pleaser? Do I have appropriate boundaries? Why do I feel lonely even in a room full of people? It's, and then just this last week, we had the suicide of Twitch, which is just devastating to hear about. And and it's kind of interesting because you see a person like that who has, from all outside perspective, all the markers of success, who seems to have community, who seems to have monetary success, who has, fame, and you think, they've reached the apex of what we would all want in life, and yet obviously struggling in ways, that are probably very personal and none of us will really understand. But then it all kind of makes us pause and wonder, like, what is life about? What do we all want? Why are we oftentimes, even when things seem to be going well, why are we so dissatisfied? Why are we struggling?
And I think that is one of the reasons why Twitch's passing has had such a ripple in many communities, but especially the Black community, because you're right, it did seem like on the outside he had all of these things that we would see as successful, want out of life, and it's hard, as I'm sure you talked about in this audience and others, it's hard to pin down what leads people to complete suicide, because of course you can't talk to those people after they're gone until we get to the next life or whatever you want to believe in, however people talk to you. But what we understand based on people who attempt suicide is that often have had losses or things that make them feel less connected to a community, and that they perceive themselves to be burdensome on other people that maybe would be a part of their community. And so, especially in the Black community, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, about how I've had to be intentional of creating community here in Utah, because sometimes I don't know if everybody is a safe person to talk to, is going to receive my emotional experience as I have to have it before I start to like curate it and change it for other people. It wasn't Twitch's death, but there was in Davis County in Utah, there was a 10-year-old Black girl that completed suicide last November. And she was on the autism spectrum and had been bullied at school. And the mom had tried to advocate for her child at the school and wasn't really getting much traction. And, you know, people from this area will know that Davis County was under investigation from the feds, in essence, for how often they have let racism go unchecked, and really many kinds of bullying they found in the report. But one of the things that the family was trying to piece together is how this girl felt like she was a burden on other people, like that she was so loved in her family, but she could go out in her school environment and from peers and from teachers and from all kinds of people just feel like she didn't have a place there. And it made me reflect on all of the times in my life where, like, very innocently, or not even connected to suicide per se, but I regularly feel like a burden on people because I have different experiences. People don't understand me, or like if I'm trying to communicate past cultural differences or assumptions that people have of me, that often feels like a burden and a weight on me. And so one of the reasons that I have been so intentional about cultivating community is to protect myself from that. But that's something that as a professional, I'm mindful of. And many people turn that kind of feeling into this shame that shows up in relationships, where it's like, oh, if I'm in a relationship with someone, and like be it romantic, friendship, or whatever, and they don't understand me, that's my fault, like I've done something wrong. And you start engaging in all of these behaviors to hide stuff from people, so that you don't feel that shame, as opposed to finding places that you can be open and really express how you feel. And so, yeah, this is like a rambly statement, but I think that shame that you're talking about, that people feel in interpersonal relationships so often is intimately connected to the risk that people have for things like suicide, mental health concerns. And so it's important to understand it and recognize the impact of that in your life. The other thing I was thinking about, as a DBT therapist, one of the things that we talk about a lot is remaining non-judgmental. So there's the kind of judgments that we make to discriminate between two things. Like, if you open up a refrigerator and get like some milk and you smell it and it, makes the little hairs singe in your nose, you can say the milk is bad. And that's a discriminative judgment. Like, you don't want to put that in your body. But then there's other things that we say are bad that we use in an evaluative sense. It's bad to show our emotions to other people. It's bad to be needy, quote unquote. And so I often tell people, well, if you feel like you're the type of person that demands a lot of your emotional relationships, then find someone who's willing to take that demand. If there's ways that you can be more effective in expressing like your emotional self, and that leads to whatever you're calling neediness, then that's fine. But needy is an evaluative judgment in most cases when people say things. And a lot of times when people are thinking about what their quote unquote problems are in relationships, they've already got that shame factor incorporated in. And so a lot of times it is people making these evaluative judgments about themselves, where like, I'm bad because I'm doing this thing, instead of thinking about, well, what is this need that I have telling me that I need from the environment, and what can I do to go get that, whether it's taking care of yourself or being more intentional about seeking that from other people.
Yeah, and this brings up such an interesting thought process, about like who gets to decide what these things are, who gets to decide what is codependent. When I was studying a lot of these concepts, 25 years ago, whenever I was going through school. I mean, I come from a Latin background myself, and I was studying codependency, and I was like, this sounds just like my family, like my Latin family.
Yes.
And it doesn't sound abnormal at all. And I think sometimes, and as you were preparing to tell me what you wanted to talk about today, you talked about the value that at least here in the United States of America, kind of the white, kind of Anglo-Saxon majority culture has placed on individualism that many of us don't really come from necessarily that culture, but that's the majority culture that has placed a lot of value on being individually stoic and put your bootstraps on and pick yourself up and don't be needy. And that comes from certain cultures in the world that has been, in a sense, kind of colonized this whole kind of area, in this space. But many of us don't come from those lands or those cultures. And then on top of it, the field of psychology has definitely been, for the most part, kind of founded by, well, maybe not founded, but
definitely dominated by
white
Western ideas.
Anglo-Saxon men. Who got to decide that a lot of us were sick if we were too needy, right?
Right.
So is there some way that we can think about, and granted, I mean, I don't want to minimize unhealthy codependency either. I mean, I do think that there is a space for learning, obviously, emotional regulation, how to self-soothe, how to know how to, not be an overly burdensome person on your people and, the people who love you and want to take care of you. But at the same time, this kind of sense of pack animalism and being, kind of a group and taking care of each other's needs. I mean, for example, I grew up, with my mother saying, nobody's moving out at 18. That's ridiculous. Like, we don't do that. That's silly. Whereas here in the United States, if you're not moving out at 18, like, there's something kind of wrong with you, right? You're not independent enough. So I don't know if you want to speak to that kind of value of individualism and what the benefits or cons are of these kinds of different cultural concepts.
Yeah, totally. I'm like that you bring up your Latin family, because I often my Achilles heel in this world is time management. And so I have opinions about many things, but I'm not like timely enough with my responses. And so it's just whatever. But I think about people's reactions to the movie Encanto, for example. You ask like who the protagonist of Encanto is, a white Western influenced person will be like Mirabel, and somebody who's used to more collective ways of thinking will be like, it's the whole family. Like, this whole family system is going through something, and colonization and trauma is the antagonist, and there's just ways that we've been primed to look at people as heroes or villains, but then for many of us, as you say, we just were not designed in that way. And so it is so important sometimes to take a step back and say, like, who is the messenger here? Who is telling me how I need to think about certain ideas and constructs? Like, where did I get this message from? That I'm codependent or needy or whoever, is that person a reliable source of information? And so I think all of these are, they're a little bit like, self-breaking questions to ask, but I feel like they're important ones to give us a sense of place in the world to really figure out what our function is. I wish that I could live without the weight of colonization and all kinds of things, but I don't. And so it's important for me to recognize like some of the strain that I feel on a daily basis just comes from just not having the same cultural environment as other people, and not even the same cultural values to collectivism and these kind of things. But then when you think about how you spend that knowledge into what would be most effective for relationship building, I think always it helps to tune into your values and what's important to you, and kind of orient what's going on in your environment based on that. Yes, many of our values are put upon us by the environment, but that's work that you can do, right, to figure it out. If I have one of my strongest values is belonging. And so that means that I often will shift other values to prioritize belonging. So I need to know that about myself, because at some point that goes too far. And then I start feeling like the itches of, the need for recalibration. But like, me wanting to belong is not a quote unquote bad value. Me wanting to belong because as a Black woman, I've spent so much of my life being different is also not a bad thing if I understand that is functionally a problem that I'm continuously trying to solve. But then I can decide if that value is something I want to keep or prioritize, deprioritize, throw away entirely. So while I can say that my values have pretty much been consistent through my life, it doesn't have to be. And so that's kind of how I evaluate what is effective when it comes to relationships. And so once you have your values help determine the types of goals that you make in relationships. And I think, I'm thinking back to a conversation I had like a couple of weeks ago where I got caught up in a short-term desire to like say what I needed to say. So I said what I needed to say, and it felt really good. But if my goal was to get something that I wanted, if it was, if there was a part of me that needs to maintain this relationship, then sometimes it doesn't work to like go on the short term of what will feel emotionally settling in the moment. And so often with these patterns of like codependency or neediness or whatever, there's this, oftentimes it can be interpreted as like a short-term problem solving type of thing that often isn't connected to overall values and goals. And what overwhelms people is that they look over the course of their life and they like start pulling out patterns from places and they say, oh no, like now I have this label of codependency, and you kind of lose sight of the fact that like you also have values that overarch your decisions and what you do. And part of your short-term problem solving is probably trying to get at that value. But then if you kind of stretch it out and think long-term about what it is you want from people, then you might think of more effective ways to do it where you're not losing self-respect in the process of trying to navigate certain issues.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I love your conversation about values. And one thing I talk to clients a lot about is we'll have a lot of values. We value a lot of things, and oftentimes our values in themselves will contradict each other. For example, if I value belonging, which I think many of us do, most of us probably do, but I also value self-respect. That is oftentimes the two values that will come in most conflict when you're part of a community.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because I want to belong to this community, but maybe parts of this community don't sit well with me, or monitor me or judge me or expect me to behave in a certain way or expect me to conform in a certain way, and whether that's your family or your church or your community center or your job, or, like all these, we belong to so many groups, right? And each group kind of has their set of rules or guidelines or kind of ideas of how you're supposed to be part of that in-group. And when you don't conform to kind of the group's ideas, that's where tension starts building. And that's where people start feeling kind of like this burden that you've been talking about of, am I a burden to the people? Am I a burden to the group? Am I a burden to myself? And where it starts weighing hard. And we know this through the research, right? This is where when people feel like they're part of the in-group, they do really well. And when people feel like they're on the outskirts of the group, that's when people are really struggling and feeling isolation, feeling suicidal, feeling all these mental health concerns. And why marginalization, we know, is so harmful, whether it's a racial marginalization, LGBTQ marginalization, family marginalization, whatever it is. And we see this in the wild, right? I mean, you see kind of the horrific animal documentaries, where there's like the one animal who's like limping along, trying to like, be part of the group, and the group is ostracizing it because it kind of knows that one animal is going to hurt the group. So it just kind of leaves it to die or leaves it to be killed off. And at some level, that's kind of what's instinctually in all of us, is the group will protect the group over one individual. And one individual will be like, okay, I'm in big trouble if I don't belong to a group. So yeah, I think what you're saying is these values and this belonging and trying to manage all of that is probably why we're all having like a little bit of anxiety come December.
Yeah. Yes, so much trying to, like I've been saying a lot lately. It's so interesting how we could say like this piece is happening and this piece is happening and this piece is happening, not like gestalt them and be like, oh yeah, they're all happening. And so then yeah, when you get to this time of year, it's like, oh, I'm fried. I was also thinking about, my my research project in graduate school was on the experiences of, it was mostly LDS people who were queer, and many people said that they would come out and they would go to a trusted individual, and like whether it was their parents or their ecclesiastical leaders or whatever, and that person would then just like say, it's okay, like if you don't talk about it, if you don't blah blah blah, like if you marry somebody of the opposite sex, like just trying to do all of this stuff to tamp it down, which of course felt invalidating to people. But in learning more about in-group out-group patterns, there is this pull toward in-group preservation, especially in like smaller conservative religious communities, especially one with a history like the LDS Church. You move from place to place to place, and there's this almost historical trauma of needing to preserve the in-group for matters of safety. And so then you come out here, and then it's like this need to preserve the in-group is outweighing the pulls toward showing love and validation and these kind of things. And it's almost as though people would rather work hard to make people seem like they're in the in group so that they don't have to do this degradation of the out group. And so looking at that, I had a lot of, not necessarily respect for, but understanding what happens when these processes aren't articulated. I think, when I look at the work that you've done, and you probably know better than most people, that finding your community takes a lot of vulnerability and like disclosure that sometimes it doesn't feel like the people around you have earned. But when you do that disclosure, then you create possibilities for everyone to come and connect with you. And so I love that, you've built a community of all kinds of people at all different stages of life who just feel that they have a path that they can go on, that they don't have to be so different from other people. Whereas a lot of people that I work with, when they haven't done this disclosure, have a lot of internalized shame because they feel like they're the only ones that are experiencing something. And I'm like, just go see, like, do an experiment and see like who can really connect with you as you are. And there are people out there for everyone. But it kind of takes, in DBT, we call this opposite action, especially for shame, to like disclose the things that you feel like will get you rejected in certain contexts. Like I don't be telling everybody all of my business, but I do decide like when, and I do this with experimentation. So I disclose this to this person, it goes a certain way, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to tweak that for next time. But I've learned in the spaces that I'm in that like I can kind of find this middle path between belonging and self-respect if I disclose more of what I'm going through so that I can get support from the people around me.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that reminds me, of course, of all the work Brene Brown is doing, right, with vulnerability and discussions on how to have, boundaries and share. And it's a risk. You're right. And that's smart to kind of do a little bit of a test, like you're saying, like, okay, if I share this amount, what tends to happen? Because, and this is where, we have a lot of, like, I'm thinking of, the young kids who take a risk even in their own family systems and will say, hey, like, I'm gay. And now all of a sudden they find themselves out on the street. And you have, even within our own Mormon community, for example, we both come from a Mormon background. So I'm going to say our Mormon community, but this can happen in any community. And then you have a lot of Mormon kids who are out there saying, hey, I'm gay. And even in that same community, you have a lot of families really rallying, and really like embracing and becoming like mom and papa dragons and joining groups and support groups on figuring out how to support these kiddos of theirs. And so even in the same community, you can have drastically different responses to this risk of sharing something authentic about yourselves, which is why people, like, you can understand why this is scary stuff, right? It's scary to share and disclose something about yourself when the stakes are high. And I guess, if you're 45 and you're fairly, self-sufficient, probably the stakes are a little bit less high than if you're 14 and at home and totally dependent on your Orthodox believing parents, who have a lot of power still, in your life. So I'd like to kind of, move this discussion into, I loved the language you used at the beginning of the show, which is intentionally cultivated community, which, if you're facing crisis, I mean, we've all been through crisis in the last 3 years, right? I mean, we all went through this kind of like national, international COVID experience. We all had unprecedented social issues come up for us. Most of us had to isolate in ways we've never isolated before. Most of us had to depend on technology in ways we've never had to depend on technology before. We're still dealing with the ramifications of that. I don't know that we'll understand until probably the next 20 years as all the research comes out, what kind of impact that's had on especially on like our toddlers, our children, our school age children. I had teenagers through all that, trying to navigate high school, and we're still very much dealing with the ramifications of that in my home. Even myself, I've noticed myself being like, do I really want to go out? I'm less social than I was.
Yeah.
I can feel it in my bones. I'm less social than I was. And I'm pretty social,
And I mean, that was I say all the time about the pandemic, it really allowed people to shift their priorities. This year, for whatever reason, for the first time, I'm like, why are we working in the winter time? It's dark outside. I don't want to do this anymore. The animals are resting. Why am I still going to work every day? And I think the pandemic, as awful as it was really good for this kind of behavioral experimentation of people saying, I need to rest at certain times. And even like the communal experience of like everybody watching Tiger King, everybody reacting to the same like memes when George Floyd was killed. I felt like people had time to like sit down and listen to what the perspectives were, as opposed to being so quick to dismiss them. And like with every other event like that that's been kind of racially stressful in the past, I felt like it didn't take much before somebody was trying to vilify or make the victim the demon, but it just took longer for that to happen in the George Floyd case. So things like that about the pandemic I really miss. But then these other things where you're evaluating your like how many social spoons you have and like just the amount of sacrifice you're willing to put in, and when you feel those benefits of not spending as much time with people, life is less complicated when you're not around as many people. And so I think that has been a kind of compelling thing in a short-term sense, to just isolate yourself from people. So then we're less practiced talking to people. So then when we talk to people, it's harder. And then it just compounds. And then your body says, see, it's better to avoid these interactions because, bad things are happening. And so, it goes back to this like anxiety you were talking about where, I do think that we'll just be looking at that for many years to come. And then to go back to kids and what the pandemic has done for youth, I think with this explosion of technology and creative uses for technology, because this generation has grown up with technology. So some of these things, especially when you're talking about queer kids, like they have access to community anywhere, because these guys be squirreling on the internet in ways that I could not do, and so that
I grew up
part.
with the dial phone, so I'm still
Oh
like,
yeah, I had that. But, we had AOL dial-up when I was in middle school, and like, I don't know, one of my good friends to this day is somebody that I met in like an LDS chat room when I was 13 years old. So, the monitoring was not there at that time. So we got a good balance going where it's like there's a little bit of monitoring, but the kids are so, slick with it that they can, find places that they can have community. But yeah, there is this, I think that it's kind of made the experience of community more binary for these kids, like even more than it was before, because teenagers just think in binary ways anyway, where things are black and white. These people are safe, people are not safe. I've seen a lot of parents come in and say, my kids are doing all this on the internet and they're not talking to us. And when you put in this power differential that is inherent in the parent relationship. And this is what parents will do in crisis. They'll respond with more boundaries, more restrictions, without the learning, without sort of the, what I would call functional analysis, to figure out like, what is it that my kid is trying to solve by doing this thing before I like tamp it down. I mean, that's a question that we should always be asking ourselves, but especially if you're in power over somebody, what is it that they're trying to solve? And how can I help them do this in a way that is safe for everyone? And so if, kids are out there in an environment that's not safe, it's good to utilize other supports like, teachers, friends of, or parents of your friends, people that can help you navigate how to get what you want from the environments that you're in, and serve as that kind of validating, empathetic, safe space. But then to parents, I think it's useful to it is so easy for me to get frustrated at my child when she's trying to solve something and I don't have any idea what she is doing. Like, where do you get these ideas? But I often tell parents that, like, if somebody, look, I don't hike at all, but if, let's say I were hiking and I got lost in the woods or something, but I still have reception and I called down to somebody in the parking lot and said, hey, I'm lost. Well, that person in the parking lot can't just start telling somebody where to go without knowing where they are. Then the directions are useless. And so it's the same for any parent that's trying to guide their kid through something, especially if they don't understand it. Like if you're not queer, if you don't, I deal with this with parents in a transracial adoption situation where their kids are different races. If you don't know where they are, then it's impossible to guide them to safety. And so there's a lot of room for the parent or the guardian or person in power to do that work, to do the research, to ask questions, be curious about what their children are going through. Because when you don't do that, then there's just room to make all these assumptions about how your kids are trying to separate. And then in crisis mode, then you just say, well, I'm going to separate you now. I'm going to put rules. I'm going to kick you out. I'm going to do all these things, when really there's so much opportunity for connection that is missed when people don't take the time to understand. And the person who is in power in this situation has more emotional room to understand than the person who feels that they've been put upon. And so, yeah, I think that all of that is important to remember when dealing with our kiddies.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think that's just like you're talking about parents. I think that's true of organizations too, or whether you're the boss of a, of a company or something like that. The person in power does have more space for the understanding, which is hard sometimes. Sometimes as the parent or the person in power, you don't necessarily always feel like you have a lot of control, which is interesting, right? Because you feel you have these people under you and you're feeling like out of control sometimes, but you are the person with the decision-making power. And that's the power that you have to remember. That's the privilege you have in order to kind of, regulate self and take that time to, take that validating and empathic listening approach, which is really hard to do, especially when you're fearful. A lot of times when we love these kids or love our people, or, if you're the preacher of a congregation or whatever, you love the people that you're trying to serve, but now you're in a space of fear. And oftentimes when we're in spaces of fear, especially in spaces of crisis, and it maybe doesn't feel like you've got a lot of time, you want to act, and opportunities are missed. And now you're in power struggle with people and spaces of disconnection instead of connection.
For sure.
That's that's hard.
Fear and anger have ways of multiplying because they're survival based emotions. And so then they have a way of being like, okay, well, what else is there to be afraid of in the environment? And then you just pick it up. And so a lot of times when you're dealing with, your interpersonal relationships, you also pick up on the fear from the other person. And then if you're not careful, then you start to intensify that in yourself and then use that to respond instead of stopping and saying, here's a place where we can connect. Because, if a parent feels a lot of fear for, helping their kid through a crisis, then they can also stop and assume that the kid also feels some of the fear. And that is one way that the intensity of the emotion is getting raised, and just reading that from your children. So yeah, just being able to stop and say, let's connect on this, as opposed to being so much in battle mode about it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Okay, so far what I'm hearing from you is, one, know yourself, right? So know yourself, know kind of who you are. Am I a person that has big emotion and needs people around them that are kind of, can jive with that? or maybe, maybe you're kind of one of those people that kind of likes things kind of calm and not a lot of, and maybe I need people around me that kind of can jive with that, or at least can communicate about those kinds of things and have discussions around those kinds of things on how we're different and how we can make space. I have a kiddo on the spectrum, and we've had a lot of really great conversations in the last probably 3 to 4 years of how to just make space, within our family system. We have a lot of different personalities just in our little 6 family unit, and different needs. We've got several of us with ADHD, some of us on the spectrum, some of us quiet, some of us loud. So just within 6
what an adventure.
Just within 6 people, you've got a lot of different stuff, like some people like a lot of noise, some people like, oh my gosh, there's too much noise. So how do you accommodate everybody in these kinds of spaces? It's particularly difficult on road trips when we're all
yeah.
in the house. It's not as hard, but in a car, it's hard. But I think that's really good. Knowing yourself, communicating with others. I think a lot of times, my dad, who was a psychiatrist, came home from a conference one time, and this was back when we still called it Asperger's, but he was like, I realize I have Asperger's. And that's how he said it. I realize I have Asperger's. And I was like, you know what? We should have realized this, because just as how he said
that. And see, yes.
And it was a big moment in our family, because, we had suffered a lot with him throughout the years, and now understanding this condition, we all had a lot more empathy. He had more empathy for himself. And once he was able to communicate that with people had a lot more ability to accommodate him. Once they realized, oh, well, this oddness or this awkwardness or this inability for you to socially kind of navigate with us isn't just because you're a weirdo, which is, I'm sure, what a lot of people thought. But once he was like, I have Asperger's, but I'd like to be your friend, and would you like to go skiing with me? People would be like, oh, okay, sure. So people, would accommodate him more once he could communicate something that was a little bit off for him. So I think and that goes back to your point on vulnerability, that when we're able to be vulnerable and share what we need. Not always. Sometimes people cannot accommodate you, and that's okay too. But a lot of times people are willing to say, well, this is what I can do, if they can be vulnerable back. And so I like that. You also mentioned kind of knowing your values and, kind of understanding what it is you value and what you want, finding people who will accept you, and being non-judgmental, and finding people who will be non-judgmental of you. So those are, I think, some really good points. What are we missing, or what else would you like to make sure we cover before we end our conversation today? I know we're kind of getting towards the end.
Yeah, I think that was a great sum up. And, if people know themselves and know their emotional experiences enough to trust them to lead them to the places they need to go, I think that is a big thing. Like, you almost need to make room for yourself too in your own emotional experiences before you make room for other people, not before, while you're making room. Like, just make room. And yeah, maintaining a non-judgmental stance often requires that we ask different questions or maintain a different curiosity rather than trying to force our way into interactions or like come quick with the boundary, because so often we're making an evaluative judgment that we might be able to figure out like what is happening. That is the disconnect. And then maybe you can find a way to connect once you have asked the right questions about things. And so, yeah.
And some of these things take time. So maybe we can spend the last few minutes, because when I think, for example, of people like Twitch or others in our community who are struggling right now, especially maybe with suicidal ideation or even having a suicidal plan in place, and you're in that space where it just seems really overwhelming, like there's really not a lot of hope. Even some of the things that we might be talking about seem like insurmountable. What are some things that we could offer that are like, well, yes, you're right, relationships do take time. This isn't something that happens overnight. Building an intentionally cultivated community, like you said, doesn't happen in a week, right? You're not going to feel better necessarily tonight or tomorrow. So what can we offer in the meantime, and what's kind of a realistic way to go about this?
Yeah, I think that if there's anything that people in that situation can like hold on to, it's the fact that there are people in the world who are prepared to make space for you. It could be the people around you, like in your immediate community, but it's also professionals. Like, as a DBT therapist, I can communicate with my clients by phone coaching, and I beg them. I'm like, call me, text me, like, let me know what's going on in your life, like, because I have the capacity and I've made space for that. And if it's not being used, I just use it for other things, but I wish that it were used for people to tell me what's going on with their lives. That's both Kimberly as a human and Dr. Applewhite as the therapist. And so reach out, to a therapist, a trained professional. We have 988, the suicide hotline. They don't call the police, they don't freak out on you. In the local area, we have hospitals with warm lines like Huntsman Mental Health Institute, and many organizations will have services like that. And so I want to make clear that it's not like you will not burden those systems. We have all taken on as an extension of our values into our professions, that we want to be there for people in that way. And so please take advantage of those resources that are out there. There is no way to burden them. And then just sometimes, if you're able to get that feedback from the people who you are closest to, even if you don't think that you're close right now, just try asking a question like, hey, sometimes I feel like I'm a burden on you. Like, can you tell me what you think about that? Or if you're struggling, tell them frankly that you're struggling, and be willing to, almost sometimes you have to say it and then do nothing and let people kind of take over it, let it sit in the space. Give yourself room for problem solving, because as you said, Natasha, things take time, but because all things in this world, all problems are caused, then most things have solutions, or at least other things that can take into effect and cause different things to happen. And so give yourself that time and also that grace to be able to find it and connect to people who want to help you.
Yeah. And like I talk about with sex and with marriage and with relationships, I think it's really, really important to have realistic expectations. I think we live in a land of advertisement and social media and movies and, a lot of spaces that everybody seems like, even I mean, I hate to keep on, bringing up Twitch necessarily, but like I look at pictures of him and oh my
So
gosh, just
happy.
my perspective, just if I project my own ideas, I'm like, this is a beautiful, happy, smiley man, like I just think, oh, like I just feel warmth, when I see him. And yet there must have been a real internal struggle there. So you can see from like pictures are just a moment, they don't tell a whole story. I mean, I look even at my own family pictures, I know all the intergenerational trauma in my family, but you look at all of our pictures and we're all like, like super happy, smiley. Like
Yes.
the photo albums don't show the intergenerational trauma stories, that my family has been through, because in those moments you're kind of just showing your best self,
Right,
in
man.
places. And so I think sometimes people are, whether it's in the church pew or in the social media, you're comparing your worst part of yourself with other people's best part of themselves. And I think when it comes to social relationships, we all struggle, we all have conflict. I don't think anybody necessarily has a relationship where every single moment is wonderful, every single friendship feels super close all the time. Most people have somewhere between 2 to 5 close relationships in their life. I've even talked to some people that are like, it seems like I'll have a good friend for like 2 to 5 years, and then we'll kind of like not be as close anymore. What's
Cycle through.
wrong with me? And I'm like, people come in and out of your life.
It'll be your season, yeah.
Who says you need to have a 50-year friendship? That's just maybe back in the day when we were less, we're very, what's the word? We move around a lot more than we used to, right? And so maybe if you lived in the same little community for 100 years, maybe you did have your one good friend, but we don't live in that kind of world anymore. And so I think it's okay to understand that relationships can be transient, and even marriages, I think a lot of people feel a lot of shame around divorce, or why couldn't we have made that work, etc. But there's chapters, there's seasons and chapters in life. So I think just working on realistic expectations and knowing that it probably is a little bit more challenging to find friendships as we age, just because we have less opportunities. I think like teenagers and college age kids and or adults, I shouldn't call them kids. I need to stop doing that.
I
because
mean,
my kids are college age
suggest.
adults.
Yes.
Anyway, so then they have more opportunity because there's more people in those spaces. But I think, but we can be, and I love your intentionality. Like, give me a few examples of how you're intentional, Kimberly.
That's a good point. So I got involved in a couple of key things right away when I moved. So I joined a gospel choir, which many people know about me, and I've been in it for the past 6 years. And I also had pretty clear goals about the types of environments I wanted to work in, because I had good experiences. But I also the more I run my mouth, the more I kind of find people I like. And I have had to learn to be intentional with the words I say because I am a tender girl at the end of the day. I have a lot of rejection sensitivity, and where you're dealing with, high demand religious communities with certain expectations. So I've had to learn how to say things in a way that will allow people to connect with me, as opposed to be like, what is wrong with you? But the more that I have learned to still do that with authenticity, I just think that I have met the best people. Because, I'll ask, the reason why I joined the gospel choir in the first place is because of a relationship that I had before with somebody who said, oh yeah, I went to this thing called Genesis and I think you'd like it. And so, I went and I loved it. And so the more that you can show up, even one place, that was just one thing I did. If you could show up one place authentically, that often has ripples that allow us to find places that we can then be more intentional about the community that we're seeking. I also think, when you were talking, I thought about a lot of like, there's myths of emotional experiencing, myths of interpersonal effectiveness that we'll talk about in DBT when we think about, Twitch, somebody who seems so happy on the surface. Like my Black clinicians colleagues and I the other day talked about how many of these things go with, what it's like to be a Black man, like, to be, to keep emotions down, to show only certain things to certain people, and being a performer, like all these ideas about how the show must go on and all of these kind of things that set our expectations of what we can get from the environment. But just being able to recognize, and again, like you were saying, set your expectations more realistically. If I feel bad because it's awkward for me to make friends as an adult, but then I'm like, oh yeah, well, I'm around less people. I spend my time at a computer building relationships. Like, I think I should be good at building relationships, but I'm like, oh yeah, because I do it at my job, but that's different. And then how much time am I actually leaving myself to do that outside of work? Then I can, make a plan based on that. Once I recognize this assumption that I'm working off of, that may not totally be like the end all be all of what reality is offering me. So
right yeah just the other night, I mean, I get invited to a lot of group things because I'm kind of known, but that doesn't mean I really get to know anybody. So the other night, my partner and I made an intentional effort of inviting two couples to dinner so that we could actually get to know each other. And it went really well. Now I remember, I don't know, it was maybe like 10 years ago or something, my ex-husband and I did the same thing and it didn't go so well. So we were like, well, those are couples we won't get to know more, right? So I mean, you have to kind of just take a risk, right? Like sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't, but that's how sometimes you can make some of your closest friends, and sometimes you don't, but you still got a good dinner out of it.
Right. And it's always good to practice, I think, like to have like willingness to do stuff in the future and say that, it's not catastrophe if you don't like jive with people, but it would be nice, like, if food is good, then this would be a good way to jive with people that I jive with. So then let me try again. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. Well, Dr. Applewhite, thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation. I think both of us as mental health therapists, we really believe in the power of relationship, the power of communication. The research hands down supports this in so many areas, from helping with things like decreasing substance dependence, from increasing physical health, from, increasing, of course, sexual and relational health, from increasing community health, right? So there really isn't an aspect of life or an organization or a community or a workplace that can't benefit from doing some intentional work around what are our relationships doing? How are we doing them? How are we feeling? Being in touch with our bodies and our emotions as we're in relationship, knowing where sometimes we have to step in, sometimes step back, sometimes get professional help, sometimes, read good books or listen to podcasts. There's lots of resources out there, but this is definitely, I think, probably one of the most important things that we can do for our well-being and health. So thank you so much for being here with me to talk about something so important. Have a very Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all the good things that you celebrate.
Thank you. The best to you too.
All
Thanks
right.
so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no. So we can always go to the homeland homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nordisch geschehen alone, so we can to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nordisch geschehen alone, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.